Greetings, grace and peace be to you in the name of the Father, and in the name of his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Today we come to Acts chapter 27, a rather lengthy chapter, but an amazing one nonetheless. I've entitled this message, Being a Source of Hope. Many of us can imagine what it might be like to be in the middle of a catastrophe, some sort of incident, where the possibility of death looms large and people are in a panic. Certainly, there are veterans who have fought in wars they don't have to imagine because that was almost daily life for them. They have experienced what it's like to be under that kind of pressure. But even beyond the scope of war, there are and have been earthquakes and tornadoes, even school shootings where panic sets in. What often happens, and I think from my perspective is probably only rarely recorded, is that God has used individuals to be leaders, to be a calming influence, raising up people with great wisdom in such situations. I think that sometimes as Christians we wonder if we would ever be up to such a task. We might feel terribly inadequate to endure such a crisis. It is of course not good to be weighed down with fear. We certainly wouldn't want to choose to go through all the challenges that Paul faced, but I do want us to be encouraged by what we read here. And I would like for us to think about how not only we as individuals, but especially collectively as the people of God, as the church, can think about being a source of hope to our neighbors and surrounding culture in times of great uncertainty. Again, like I said, this is a long chapter, but let's look at the many lessons that are in fact here for us. Verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. Evidently, Festus had what he needed by this time. He must have had a letter of explanation for Paul's imprisonment and his need for a trial. He must have waited until there was an appropriate number of prisoners to send on to Rome and not just give Paul a personal escort. He also directed Julius, who was assigned to the auspicious imperial regiment, to make all the preparations, which we will see included several decisions regarding how to transport all these prisoners. It is interesting to me that they did not have a specific Roman naval vessel to transport prisoners, but relied on what we might call the merchant marines to carry out the Roman government's assignments. Verse 2. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. This man who travels with Paul, Aristarchus, had already known some challenging times with Paul in his ministry. He is mentioned in Acts chapter 19, verse 29, and chapter 20, verse 4. Paul describes him later on as he writes his letters as a fellow prisoner in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. And there's another brief mention of him as a fellow worker of Paul's in the book of Philemon. We also know that Luke accompanied Paul as well. He writes on several occasions in this chapter using the words us and we. These men were most likely not prisoners along with Paul, but the Roman government did allow friends to accompany and supply the needs of prisoners. They may have had to pay their own way. Verse 3. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. Here's the first reference to the kind of respect the centurion affords Paul throughout this adventure. It is interesting that Christian churches had been established in so many parts of the Roman world, even at that time. Paul must have been received warmly and must have answered many questions about his situation. Verses 4 through 6. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us aboard. Already they were experiencing some difficulties and delays. There are many maps available that describe this journey. You may have such a map at the back of your Bible if you have a study Bible. The centurion makes the decision to board another ship. This one from Egypt was most likely hauling grain from Egypt to Rome. As we know from history, Rome was heavily dependent on this as a source of food from the Alexandria region of Egypt. Verses 7 through 8. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Sindus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salome. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. The details of all these events are so well described that many people have marveled at the account that Luke provides for us. As we can tell, everyone is concerned at this point because there's still so many miles to go, and they're already well behind schedule. Verses 9 and 10. Much time had been lost, and sailing already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo, and to our own lives as well." Paul has the ability to speak to all who are making the decisions. He says what's on everyone's mind. Paul, even at this point, tells them that all of their lives are in danger. Verse 11. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Not only does Luke provide us the information that Paul's advice will not be followed, but this also shows the interesting relationship between a Roman military authority and those who own and control the operation of the boat. The centurion listens to their advice and follows it. This is another occasion in which the technical expertise of the day will not be an effective course of action. This isn't to say that we should never heed the advice of technicians, especially in our own day, but we also know who to look to as the ultimate authority, for even sometimes the technicians of our day get it wrong, don't they? Verse 12. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. Here is further explanation as to why it was thought it was better to move on. The boat wouldn't necessarily be well protected from the winter storms, and it probably would have been quite challenging to make housing arrangements for prisoners and crew to spend the winter in that small town. It is also interesting that Luke refers to the majority of decision makers. I would think that this would not refer to the prisoners, but it's interesting that he uses this word majority. Almost feels like something like a democracy at that time. May not have been the case, but the majority who were listening to the owner of the ship and the pilot of the ship had agreed that they should go on. Verses 13 through 20. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the nor'easter, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. This is about as catastrophic as it gets. They had no way of knowing where they were. They could not control the ship. They threw away much of what they could, but for me, the real clincher is that Luke even included himself when he said that we finally gave up all hope of being saved. There are a number of occasions in the Bible where storms on the sea are described. In the Old Testament, there's Jonah. There's a very interesting one listed also in Psalm 107 that's very similar to the experience that Jonah had. In the New Testament, there are those accounts of Jesus and the disciples being in a storm on the Sea of Galilee. In those accounts, the Lord answers prayer, and the sea is stilled. This account is obviously different. The storm lasts so long that people really despaired. Also, I'd like to point out that in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, Paul writes how he had gone through 3 shipwrecks and had spent a day and night on the open sea. I think that Paul wrote that letter before his experience here. If that is the case, then Paul has already had plenty of experiences in this type of crisis. But this one probably lasted the longest of all of his shipwreck experiences. Verse 21. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss." The despair was so great that all had given up on eating. Why eat if you're about to die? Yet Paul once again stands up and speaks to all of them. The first thing he says is obvious, it's matter of fact, and perhaps a little annoying. In essence, he is telling them, "I told you so." But as we see next, he is not gloating over being the one who had such wisdom. Verses 22 through 26. "But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.'" Paul had already been told by Jesus that he would testify in Rome. Now an angel confirms that message to him, and Paul wants to bless everyone with this knowledge and hope. It was also comforting that they would eventually land on an unspecified island. In chapter 28, we find out that it was in fact the island of Malta, which has historical significance from several perspectives. But it's just interesting to me that the angel did not specifically identify the island for Paul. Verses 27 through 29. "On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight." Even though they could not see land at midnight, there was a sense that they were close. Measurements were taken, and it was true that they were approaching land with no way of knowing when they might crash into it. Verses 30 through 32. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. Here's a very interesting development. The crew wanted to leave the ship, but that would have been disastrous for the rest of the passengers, including Roman soldiers who were not trained for naval purposes. The Roman soldiers probably recognized Paul's wisdom right away, and so cut off the ropes to the lifeboat. Now everyone was in the same position. The Lord had promised that the lives of all would be spared, and yet Paul knows too that the promise of God had to be fulfilled in a certain way. This brief reference in the story is a great reminder of what we often call the sovereignty of God, and yet also the tension of human responsibility. Verses 33 through 34. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days," he said, "you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from your head." Here again, Paul addresses their tendency toward despair. No one will be able to use the lifeboat. They are all in the same condition now. Encouraging them to eat was an act of faith and of hope. They needed physical strength. We don't know exactly what kind of food was available, But obviously, even with all that was thrown overboard, there was still enough for everyone to have this one last meal. The phrase "not losing one hair of your head" was an expression to encourage them that they will survive. Jesus used the same phrase as well in Luke chapter 21, verse 18, verses 35 through 38. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. In some ways, this is similar to Jesus breaking bread and feeding multitudes. Some have thought that this was more like a communion service. Paul was not claiming that this was communion, but he was honoring God in the eating of this meal, once again highlighting the aspects of faith and hope as they are about to be delivered from the shipwreck. Verses 39 through 41. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground, if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they let them in the sea. They left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. They did their best to land on the beach, and they came short. In getting stuck on the sandbar, the ship was being pounded by the waves, and in a few moments would be unrecognizable as a ship. It wasn't an ideal landing, but at least they were somewhere in the surf, and they could see the land. Verses 42 through 44. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. The idea of the soldiers killing the prisoners was part of their training. Soldiers who allowed prisoners to escape could be executed. But once again, the centurion, Julius, recognizes Paul's wisdom. He can't bear to see Paul, who had done so much for everyone on board, to be killed in this way. It also didn't make sense that Paul would be the only prisoner spared. God was at work in the heart of the centurion. As promised by God, all were spared. Where do we find encouragement in this portion of God's Word? It is possible that God can use us too as a source of hope to people in crisis. We can be a voice of encouragement even when we have to share the sufferings of the people during hard times. Certainly this is true in so many places where despair sets in. I don't know when we will hear the stories coming out of Ukraine of how ordinary people became heroes, but I am certain someday the Lord will show us. We too can tell people that we suffer. Sure, we suffer in this world. But the ultimate deliverance has already been promised to us. We live in the light of that promise. We worship in the middle of suffering and difficulty. And by God's grace, we will see people like the centurion Julius come at least to some recognition of the value of following Jesus. May we all know what it is to follow Jesus. May we all know in times of crisis and in times of peace. Jesus Christ is Lord of our lives. May we be privileged to be able to be a source of hope in this world that so desperately needs it. God bless you.